So hi everyone. I'd much rather be in the room with you all, catching the vibe of seeing your expressions up close and personal, but I'm really honored to be here. And I just want to start by sharing that I am in day 4 of a juice cleanse detox at a health institute called Optimum Health Institute in San Diego. So I hope that that will relieve some of the pressure if occasionally my synapses aren't firing exactly as they should. It's an amazing place. It's a mind, body, spirit sort of healing space here, and really exciting. But it does mean that I'm not necessarily firing on all cylinders. So we'll see how this goes. And I wanted to just share a little bit about myself to start. You know, it was exciting to think about talking about social change movements in the context of leadership. And my work is I get to teach at UC Santa Barbara 1 semester a year. I teach a couple of graduate courses in the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management. One is a grassroots organizing and social movements class, and the other is a social media class. And they're both 5-week sprints that those students do. And then I teach an undergrad class in environmental communication, which is a lot of fun. And we cover the gamut from storytelling to PR to writing, framing, messaging, social media, publicity campaigns, engagement campaigns, and what have you. So that's sort of what keeps me busy in the wintertime. And the rest of the year, I'm a communications strategist. So I consult with a lot of different environmental, human rights, environmental justice, climate justice organizations, and over the years have also worked in criminal justice reform, healthcare reform. And so, you know, my orientation both to communication but also to leadership comes out of this this place of trying to make change in the world, you know, and believing that we have not only a right but a responsibility to be audacious in thinking about how the world could be more just, more sustainable, more loving, and how to create that through the campaigns that we run and the ways that we communicate. And so in thinking about what I want to share with you all today, there's a combination that we'll cover together of both sort of the personal qualities of leadership, and I think that these can pertain to anything. So no matter what field you find yourself in or imagine you'll be in when you're finished with this program, these personal sort of leadership qualities or leadership mindsets, orientations are ones that I hope will be useful to you all. And then I also wanted to talk about it in that context of leading for change, because when we're leading for change, we might then want to have a conversation a little bit about how do you make change? What are some of the theories of change or change models that we might use to in social movements to make change? And so that's sort of the goodies that I'm going to offer today, and we'll have a little time for an exercise. And there were lots of different exercises that I could have chosen for you to do in I think that this one we'll probably do as a solo write for a couple minutes, and then a share in small groups, and then we'll come back together for a little time at the end. And I chose something that was actually far more personal leadership oriented than social change oriented, because I felt like it would be more relevant to all of you. And one of the things I also asked your esteemed host, Mr. Cool, to do was to ask you if you had particular questions for me. One of the things I'm comfortable with and I wanted to make sure to do is to offer an opportunity for what, from a pedagogical perspective, we might call emergent design. And that is that, you know, I'm here to be in service to what you all need in the room. And knowing that I both teach environmental communications and work in social movements doing communication strategy, is there a particular thing that you want me to focus on, that you want me to be sure to cover? And so I don't know if Rick, there were responses to that you want to put into the chat, or if there's anything that you want to share before I start to make sure I leave enough time for that.
I didn't.
And if not, I'll just jump in.
Okay. I also haven't had a chance to check my email this morning because we've been here. So perhaps we can go on for a bit, and then if there are questions that pop up, we can just pose them. Okay. And since I'm watching the screen, throw something at me, or let me know if you'd like to ask, because she can't see everybody in the class either. Okay.
I actually have a small video window, which is great. And so are you seeing my screen?
We just lost your audio.
She just talked.
Okay. Yeah. Where's the? How do we? Where's the? Where's the?
Yeah. Okay. Let's do that. I'm taking out my headset. It might be me. So you've got me now, and you can hear me now?
Okay, now we can hear you. I'm
Great.
going to put the volume up a little bit here.
Great, and I'll do the same. So I decided to begin in thinking about leadership in the social change space, and what popped into my mind first was beloved community. And beloved community, for folks who aren't familiar with it, is a concept that was first developed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So I understand you've had on your plate over the last couple of days. Here's just one quote that speaks to what Dr. King is talking about when he talks about beloved community, because here this quote is answering the question of why do we lead? And we're not just leading to make change. We're not just leading to change policy or change corporate practices or to change the way our community works or our families, our churches. There's another way in which leadership can cultivate something that wasn't there before. And so he's talking, of course, about civil rights movement. And he's saying, in the end, the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform oppressors into friends. The type of love that I stress here is not eros, a sort of aesthetic or romantic love, not philia, a sort of reciprocal love between personal friends, but it is agape, which is understanding goodwill for all men. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. It is the love of God working in the lives of man. This is the love that may well be the salvation of our civilization. And this is part of his organizing model. This is part of his theory of change. He's not just looking to change the United States in the 1960s so that people have the right to sit anywhere they want on the bus or anywhere they want at a lunch counter or use the same bathroom. You know, there is an actual ultimate destination that is possible here. And for me, the idea of beloved community, along with Ubuntu, a South African idea that my wellness, my well-being is deeply and intimately tied up with the well-being of you, of all y'all. That you know, that those two concepts I think are really concepts that for me are at the foundation of the kind of leadership that we're talking about if what we really do want to do is make lasting change. And of course, I am from the United States, right? So I'm from a country where there's a spirit for revolution and independent thinking, where Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the framers of the country, and one of our presidents said, it is not only your right but your responsibility to be all up in the business of how your government is doing, and if you have to create justice by taking up arms against them, if you have to break the law because there's a moral flaw in that law, that is what we are asking you to do as Americans, right? So my orientation, our orientation as American activists is rooted in some of that as well. And that's where the title for my thoughts come from, and also, again, the foundation of how I think about leading for change specifically. I had some fun with this. I saw that you had been playing with these 7 action logics of leaders, and so I decided to look at this and think about myself. And I would say that if I was going to say the percentage of me, of the way that I lead, I would say that I am 49% strategist, 49% alchemist, and 2% expert. And that's how I run my consulting practice, and that's what I bring as a coach. I coach people to find their voice as spokespeople and speak truth to power. I also strategize with them about what needs to be said and articulated, and exactly how to articulate it in in the way that works best for that audience, that's the most loving, the most respectful to the audience, and delivers the message so that the audience will be motivated to change their mindset, change their behavior, and help to shift culture in a way that is hopefully fomenting justice. So that's sort of my orientation. I just figured I'd offer that. But the other thing I want to say as I come to talk with y'all is that I come humbly and I come with beginner's mind. And for people who aren't familiar with the idea of the beginner's mind, it's a concept that comes out of Zen Buddhism. And it's the idea that you can, even if you have experience, even as an expert or a strategist or an alchemist,
Celia,
that if you
Celia,
can come, yes.
Can you put your screen, like run the slideshow and then it'll take up the full screen? Right now.
Oh, sure, I can absolutely do that. I can absolutely do that. Let's see. There we go. That better? Okay. So, wow, and I can still see you. That's so exciting. I love Blue Jeans. This is a great, great program we're working with here. Anyway, the reason I wanted to mention Beginner's Mind is this idea that, there are some of you in the room who may have experience in nonprofit or social change, environmental campaigns or communication. There are some of you who may never have a desire to do that. And, all of us have a tremendous amount to gain by cultivating this playful, inquisitive beginner's mind and what's possible there versus what sometimes can happen in the sort of narrow focus of the expert's mind. So I just wanted to offer that as a way to orient how I'm coming to all of you. And I hope to learn a lot today. I hope we have the opportunity for a great conversation. I'm going to talk a lot about climate justice and environmental justice. These are the movements that I've been working and organizing in. And again, having done a lot of different things, this is the place I sort of hang out the most. And so I wanted to just start by defining that a little bit. And there are lots of different definitions out there, but this is what I wanted to use for today's talk. And the key thing here is that we're exploring environmental climate issues and sustainability issues, this work, seeing it as inextricably linked, not just to social justice, not just to human rights, but to a deep expression of our truest humanity, love, morality. And at the intersectionality of that is a really important concept. And I think it's one of the core concepts in leadership and social change movements. And we see it in the leaders that many of us most respect in these movements, which is that the work is done by and done with and done for and aligned with those who are most disproportionately affected. And this idea of leadership, this idea of decision making and policy making and culture shifting that puts at the center those who have the most to gain or lose is an orientation towards leadership that, again, I think could be brought into any work environment and is another foundational piece, another foundational pillar in the way that I've seen some of the best leaders in the best practices that I've seen, of people doing the work that they do, leading for change, for social change. So with that, this one I think you've probably seen before, but again, this just another fun piece that speaks to this sort of question of how are we imagining ourselves as leaders when we're leading for change. And I love this quote, which comes out of Australia, the Murray people. If you've come here to help me, you're wasting our time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And so again, this idea, because power is a big piece of what you've got to delve into when you're leading for change. And so this piece, it allows us to imagine a power dynamic that is different than some of the other leadership models, perhaps, that we're used to. And there were a few things that I just wanted to share in terms of thinking about how change happens, specifically how culture shift happens. Because I don't just want in my work for a few people to do things more sustainably, or for one particular valley or watershed or ocean or desert to be protected, or for certain people who've been poisoned by a naughty neighbor of a factory or a company that's been dirtying up their neighborhood to clean up. I mean, those things are all important, but I'm looking for a long-term culture shift. And if we're leading and we're developing leadership models that are actually going to shift culture, what might that look like? And there are a lot of people who talk about this, but I have a couple things I just want to share with you around this. And this wheel here, which becomes much more of a spiral that spirals in and spirals out in my work, is sort of a great example of some of the work that we would do as leaders and as leading communicators to create a better world. And so the first thing, they say in any kind of crisis management that step one is acknowledge the crisis, right? So crisis management PR begins with acknowledging, that there is a crisis. And I think once that's happened, creating a sense of urgency is really key. And so, but we're looking to do that in a really responsible way. We don't just want to, swoop in and create a lot of chaos and fear and then ditch out, and I don't actually like fear as a motivator. And so when I'm thinking about developing frames and messages for my clients, I'm really interested in switching that up. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about language. So the next piece here is we spin around the wheel, change leaders and other key players. And so, this idea of how do you actually get people who have the power to and the authority to do the right thing, to make change, role model, train people, change the reward system, and create new stories and symbols. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but this work and flat world knowledge as a source is something that you can draw on. And I'll send this PowerPoint so that you can have it and click on these links and don't feel like you have to take a lot of notes. But this is one. This is another culture change process, and this is comes out of the business world, and this is thinking about social good businesses or businesses that are sustainable businesses. And there are a lot of things happening here. The one I'll probably want to draw your attention to is smack in the middle there of community leadership. And for me, some of the most interesting stuff that I'm always looking at is how do we shift power so that we are leading and we're inspiring people, but we're not creating a shift from a dependency on one system to a dependency on the other? How are we instead building people power? And so for me, I have an ideological plan. I've got something I'm trying to achieve when I'm doing this work, which is to move us from a place where we're more dependent on government and corporations to meet our needs and to help us live fully expressed, healthy, sustainable lives. And instead, how do we build a community of people around us that and foster in ourselves and our family the kind of leadership that it actually takes to face what's coming. I mean, I'm sure that at some point, if you haven't already, I'm sure in the course of your studies, you'll be bombarded with some of the realities of the challenges that we face at this particular time on planet Earth. And it is a time at which everybody being fully powered up and able to chip in is going to be particularly important. And to do this conversation with you, I felt like part of what I wanted to do was mention something that you can't walk into a nonprofit organization in the United States without hearing about these days. It's an incredibly popular conversation and an important conversation. It's a conversation that looks at what is your theory of change. So we're asking people on an ongoing basis to explain, we know that something is the way it is now, and there's a way that it might be more sustainable, more environmentally friendly, more just, and equitable. What does that look like, and how do we get from A to B? And that's essentially your theory of change. And Keystone Accountability is a great place to look if you become more interested in theories of change. But this is an example of a great definition of theories of change. So this is, an explicit presentation of the assumptions. Hold on to that, because we're going to come back to assumptions in a bit as leaders, kind of flexing our muscles. Assumptions are critical. So an explicit presentation of the assumptions about how changes are expected to happen with any particular context. And in relation to a particular intervention. And so this theory of change, as organizations develop it, help us understand who has to do what, which actors have to act in order for us to achieve and sustain this vision of whatever our goals are. And also helps us to see the places where they connect. And in old school, for people that are old enough to remember before social media, if you were doing publicity or public relations, the question was, what do we want? Who can give us what we want? And what do they read, watch, and listen to? Well, now it's not just who do they read, watch, and listen to. It's who do they follow on Twitter and what's in their Facebook feed and whose email blast will they open and what subject line is more likely to get them, and where do they hang out at night if for offline, if we want to go find them, what do they do for fun? Those kinds of questions. But this understanding both of the underlying assumptions that folks are carrying and then who it is we need to talk to get them to shift and see beyond those assumptions. This piece is a theory of change. And all of the nonprofits that I do work with are very caught up right now in identifying this. And people have different ways of doing something. If your idea is to end hunger, there may be people who work in the parliament and are very focused either at the provincial or national government level at programs and policies and changes that can be made in those spaces that could end hunger. If you're trying to end hunger, you may decide that you're going to open a soup kitchen and feed people, and everywhere in between there is a theory of change that underlines the choice you make about how you're going to intervene to make this change. So, and this is something which I wanted to share, and I wanted to turn you on to something which if I had one more day with y'all, I would come in and play around story of self, us, and now. But Marshall Gantz is an amazing thinker on the subject of public narrative. And he talks about the idea to reach people and move them from the stagnation to the motivation. And so this conversion of these things that we all feel in the face of injustice or environmental crisis, inertia, apathy, fear, isolation, self-doubt. What's the corollary and how do we move people? The last being YCMAD stands for You Can Make a Difference. Another key piece that leaders who are leading to change the world need to be focused on, getting people to recognize they have a role to play and something can be done. Marshall Gantz probably first rose to prominence for his work with the United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta here in the United States. And he helped those individuals who faced oppression and bias for their race to be able to develop a story, the story of themselves, the story of us, which initially was the people who wanted to also eat grapes. This was during the great grape boycott of the 70s in the United States. And then the story of now, which is this moment in time that you place these public narratives to help create an understanding of the urgency and the need for the intervention in this moment. And story of self, us now, if you happen to ever pay attention to President Obama, our president, or even watch speeches by almost anybody in his cabinet, they use this model. And this returned as a really popular model as playing a role in helping Obama to get elected in 2008. And it was something he used in all of his stump speeches, and also something that the people who went door to door for him used. So that, he would say things like, "Oh, isn't it amazing? Here I am, and my grandmother was an immigrant, and she came to the country, and she had this dream that things could be different, and what a miracle that me as an African American man can be president of the United States." And then, but it's not just me. I met Jane over here when I arrived, and Jane's going through a similar thing, and her family, against all odds, managed to raise from the ashes of this tornado, and reopen her store, and so he goes from self to us and then to now. And that's why it's so important right now that we support these programs that are going to help you to rebuild your country, your community after this natural disaster, because this is the challenge of our moment, so get behind this bill or this policy. So, and that process, that story of self, us now, is a model for storytelling that I really encourage you to check out. And Marshall Gantz has written some really wonky academic works that are with long citations and great abstracts that I'm sure you can appreciate for your academic brain. And then there's also a lot of fun PowerPoint decks and video workshops and things that you could take if you wanted to geek out on this stuff a little bit more. But I wanted to bring this in because this is the holy grail of leading for change, is this movement that you can move people from a place where they feel like they can't be part of, and they can't even possibly see the change, let alone feel that they could rise from where they are to make it happen, to a level of motivation that plugs them in and gets them fired up. And I want to say a little bit about power because, when I'm thinking about leadership, it's all about power. And there are a lot of different models of power. And I don't know exactly where this first came from. I saw it written by an amazing activist who also happens to be a self-proclaimed witch. She's part of the pagan reclaiming community. Her name is Starhawk, and she writes both fiction and nonfiction. I'm sure this came from somewhere else, but I first saw her writing about it as this distinction between power over, power with, and power within. And anybody who's ever had a job, anybody who has a sibling, or possibly even people who hang out with their parents, even if you've never had a job or don't have siblings, knows what this is about. And the distinction between what it looks like to lead by power over versus what it looks like to lead by power with, and what it means to cultivate power within, and how critical that is for you in your own leadership, and also what's possible in communities and in terms of making change in our culture when everyone is cultivating that power within. So to me, again, this is another core tenet that I think of when I think about leadership in the context of social change. And to go a little bit further with this, there's for folks who've ever had the opportunity to look at healing oppression and isms of any kind, sexism, racism, classism, homophobia, there's a conversation about power in this context. This idea that power can be visible, it can be hidden or invisible, and it can be invisible. So visible power structures we come up against all of the time, and there's a clear line of authority of who's in charge and what that power looks like. Hidden is a little more subtle, and then invisible power that folks talk about as this idea of the internalization of powerlessness. So internalized racism, internalized sexism, internalized homophobia, these kinds of things where we notice that we're dissing ourselves, that we are othering ourselves inside of ourselves. And understanding power in this way is another best practice that I've seen in people who are leading for change, really starting to go deep into understanding what power looks like, what oppression looks like. What does it mean if you have perceived power? It's clear that, for example, if you're in an organization and you have someone who you directly report to, it is clear that they have power and they can exercise that power in different ways. But who are the other people that have perceived power? And that's who you choose to give that power to. It might be somebody else who's also a management. It might be someone who's a founder of an organization. It could be someone who's worked there longer than you. It could be someone who, because of who they are in the world, you imagine that they have more power. You perceive that they are more powerful than you. And so a process of leadership that I think is really important if we're going to change culture and make the world a better place is to help people to uncover how they perceive power and where they give their power away. And this piece is probably one of the most important things that you can play with inside of yourself. It's one of the pieces you have control over. You may not have a lot of control other than one vote over who's leading your, community, provincial, national government. You may not have a ton of power over other aspects of the way leadership is breaking down. But the way you orient your brain and your thinking, your mindset towards your relationships to folks, and where you give your power away versus where you claim your power and use it to lead, that is something that you can control. And so this is a piece that I think is really exciting and important. And I started to make this distinction anyway, but just this idea of the distinction between personal power and institutional power, and starting to see that. One of the best things that we can do in social change movements is to help people to begin to see their personal power. And whether that's the power of the purse or the power of the checkbook, as we talk about with the opportunities to make choices in the products that we buy, thereby promoting or supporting certain types of ecological practices or sustainability practices over another. It's a personal power that we can wield, along with our voting power. We also have all sorts of personal power to just show up and bring our gifts into opportunities for change. But understanding the dynamics of these is
is useful if we're going to think about leading. So power matters, and so do motivations. And this is the thing. I mean, I am assuming that you're all fantastic people and that you're doing the studying that you're doing now because you want to lead in ways that make the world a better place. And so I'm just going to run on that assumption here today. So what does it look like for you then to actually claim your own personal motivations and goals and to really get mindful at a deep level as you hone your own leadership skills, no matter what you're going to lead in? You know, you have an opportunity to lead no matter where you go and no matter what it looks like on the organizational chart, the job they hire you into, you can lead. And some of the most powerful leaders are people who lead from a place of perceived powerlessness, and yet they're amazing leaders. And I think these three pieces, why you do what you do, how you do what you do, and then communication, what you tell us about what you do, and how good you are at doing that, are really the pieces that make the difference in being someone who, regardless of where you are in a power structure, can motivate people and lead people and cultivate a lot of perceived power. And so this commitment, approach, and communication are these three pieces that I think also really, really matter. And words matter. Words matter a lot. And I know that you're finding this in your studies already. And it's particularly important out there in the world right now. And a couple things I just want to say about this in the context of communication is that you don't have to talk to everybody, but you have to reach the key audiences. And so the ability to figure out who those people are and to map who you need to reach and reach them and talk with them and in a way, not at them, but with them in a way that motivates them, I think is really important. How many people, just out of curiosity, have read Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point? Has anybody read that book, The Tipping Point? A couple hands going up, I see. Maybe one only? Couple. So, you know, Malcolm Gladwell does a great job in his book of telling lots of fun stories that really get to the bottom of this idea of key audiences. And he just, for fun, happens to break up these audiences into three groups. And he talks about mavens, connectors, and salesmen. And he tells dozens of stories from, Paul Revere's ride in the founding of the United States all the way through contemporary business, of showing how salesmen, people who are particularly reaching them, people who are particularly good at selling other people on stuff and getting people excited about things. Connectors, people who are really good at connecting people and organizations and concepts to one another. And then mavens, people who have a deep well of information on a particular topic, are the three kinds of people that if you can get some of them, you can actually make really big change and shift culture. And it's a fun read. I know you probably have a lot of reading, so you might roll your eyes if I suggest a book or two, but I do really recommend, of all of Malcolm Gladwell's books, I actually think The Tipping Point is still the most important. But the other things I'll just say about words before we move on is this idea of, how do you say it with feeling? How do you say it and invoke heart and love? And don't be afraid, even as you're looking at important, very technical, scientific-oriented communications, how do you communicate them with love? I mean, what we're finding, which is so interesting, the latest psychological studies that are coming out are showing us that people are not remembering a lot of the science when it's given to them in a really technical kind of a wonky way. And some of it is an ideological block. Some of it is confirmation bias, which you may know of. Or how many folks have heard of the phrase confirmation bias by any chance? Anybody? Okay, I'll toss out. Basically, confirmation bias is this tendency to listen. And as we listen, we pick out parts of the conversation that sort of support our own existing beliefs and values. And so it's a psychological process where no matter what someone's saying, we reinforce our worldview with it. And if you couple that with the filter bubble, this idea that social media, news feeds on Facebook and Twitter, even your Google News search or your Google word searches are designed by algorithms that want you to like them and keep coming back. The social media systems and the online systems are literally trying to give us more of what it thinks we want, so that we will like them and stay with those places. So between confirmation bias in psychology in our minds and the filter bubble, which gets created in our social media spaces, and if you haven't heard about the filter bubble, there's a great probably 11 or 15-minute TED Talk that you can listen to by a gentleman named Eli Pariser. He was the boy wonder that was the force behind Move On, which is a U.S.-based organization, online mobilization organization with millions and millions of members. I think you guys have a Canadian version of it, but I'm blanking on the name. Anyway, Eli talks about the filter bubble, and I think that's also another really good thing to check out, just to sort of recognize the limitations and the sort of container that your audience is already in. But because of those things, we're in a time where people are not necessarily really responding as well to messages that are super brainy as much as they're responding to messages of the heart. And I also would say, look, there's a really awesome romanticism that the environmental movement started with. The folks in this country who really made it happen, Aldo Leopold and Ralph Waldo Emerson and others, they talked about intrinsic values and the idea that it's not just about the selfish, self-serving reasons that we should be paying attention to or protecting other life on this planet, but that there is a value in it just as it is. And I don't know what's going on up in Canada, because you guys have some pretty beautiful country up there, but in major cities across the US, there's a whole trend about rewilding, that like we all have nature deficit disorder and we need to rewild ourselves, and that conversation is very, very heart-based. And people are getting traction with that. And they're getting the same results in terms of changes in eating behaviors, transportation, all sorts of areas that policymakers have been trying to get people to change by talking to their heads. And so I think talking to the heart and really making space for and allowing a lot more heart into the communication is both in social change movements and also in business and sales, product development. I think in our realm, it could be very, very useful. The other thing I just want to speak to is this idea of the language of struggle versus the language of transformation. And where do we allow language to be accurate, and where do we allow language to be vague and void of emotion? So, for example, are folks familiar with the concept of like big factory fish trawlers, the big factory fishing that goes for a particular species, and they like grind with a gigantic sort of bulldozer boat across the bottom of the ocean? Anybody heard of this factory trawling, fishing, big fishing? So it looks, again, a couple of people raising their hand. When people, the weird thing about this is there are literally hundreds of thousands of pounds of fish that weren't the species that they planned to catch, and they get thrown back into the ocean and they die. And they call that bycatch. Or, for example, when it's time to mine a metal or some type of resource that humans want out of the earth, and they scrape away all of the vegetation, the forests, the deserts, scare off all the critters, move the birds off, and literally remove everything that's alive on the crust of the earth so that they can get to that resource source. Everything they've scraped off, folks like to call, quote unquote, overburden. And, in both those cases, like maybe murder is too strong of a word, but it's a little more accurate, And when do we use those phrases versus when do we tell the story of how it really needs to be told? And I've heard, for example, conflict metals or conflict gold. That is a way to talk about the socio-political ramifications of mining for precious metals or golds. Because literally, especially on the African continent, but in other places around the world, major wars, major upsets are happening among communities. People are dying every day as a result of these practices. And so this idea of calling it a conflict metal, or calling a place that's being destroyed a sacrifice zone. What does it look like to kind of find the language that, without going overboard for your audience, because you want to respect them, really is a way that you can tell the truth in a way that's a little bit better. And so, that's sort of another piece. I'm going to share a few more things, and then I want to make sure we have some time for you to do an exercise and for us to have a bit of a conversation. I'm going to talk about story for just a moment, because Every leader, regardless of where you display your leadership, I believe, needs to tell good stories. And no, this isn't a typo. I actually capitalized G and capitalized S because I was really wanting to emphasize, tell good stories, good stories. You probably know we're humans, we're wired for story. Story is a great capsule for delivering the facts. And it's a chance to talk about this idea of show, don't tell, which is, I think, one of the most important concepts in strategic communication. Show, don't tell. How do you tell us a story or use images, sound, video in a way that helps us to feel and really experience what you want us to know, as opposed to telling us stuff? But also, in your leadership, you want to become the expert or the trusted messenger or the alchemist. But you want to be trusted as the person to go to. And that's why good stories are important. And this is probably the most important piece of why this matters so much. We need help to help people to make meaning. Stuff is happening all over the place all the time. Leaders help people to make meaning so that then people can look at the world around them and consider what kind of change they might be interested in. And here's the thing. This is the pickle. Because we all think about the currency of narrative as being true. Okay, I'm going to tell a story. I'm going to give you all the facts and figures. I'm going to show you pie charts. And if I just bombard you with what's going on, you'll be so overwhelmed, just like I was, that you'll come along and want the policy or the change that I'm calling for. And that's one of the mistakes that in the United States, the progressive left has made over and over. And it's the reason why our government looks like it looks and why we've had, decades of, Reagan and Bush and Bush Jr. a couple of times, and why the makeup of our House and Senates and our governors across our states looks like it looks. Because the right was speaking to the heart and the left was speaking to the head, and progressives blew it. And so this idea that the currency of narrative isn't truth, it doesn't mean lie, but the currency of narrative is not truth, it's meaning. The currency of narrative, story being one of the most important ways that we communicate to lead, meaning is the currency. So no, we're not going to tell lies, but we are going to make meaning. And making meaning is one of the most important jobs of a leader who's leading to create social change, to foster social change movements, and to motivate people to change culture. There's a bunch of different models for how change happens, and I think I may actually skip over these for now and maybe come back, but I wanted to show you a couple of different pieces of how we go about thinking about these things. But I want to go here because this, I think, is really the most important spot for us. And I mentioned assumptions earlier. Underlying assumptions are some of the most important things to play around with for you yourselves as individuals to reveal to yourself and to understand about your audience so that you can get a sense of what assumptions are holding people locked in to a particular belief system or particular mindset, and how, by leading them, by creating an intervention of some sort that is appropriate for the moment in time, you're going to actually be able to get a shift on this. And so here are some examples of what I mean when I'm talking about underlying assumptions. Sometimes we assume, for example, that that's just the way it is. These things are just what they are. There's nothing that we can do. Or that, on a personal level, if we speak up about something, no one's going to believe us. Or there are a number of different ones. And you can analyze, begin to look at underlying assumptions. One of my favorite ways to do that is to grab a newspaper article. Grab 2 or 3 newspaper articles from different outlets about a topic going on in your world right now. And as you analyze the coverage, look at what are the underlying assumptions. What do I have to buy into? What do I have to believe is true about the way the world works for me to get this article and be led in the way that they are telling the story? And I talk even from taking it one step deeper here, beyond underlying assumptions. There are things that you could even call control mythologies. And these mythologies are so deeply rooted in our cultures that they literally lock us. They completely immobilize us into that stagnation because we assume these things are true. And there are lots of underlying assumptions and lots of control mythologies. But a couple of examples, maybe it's that you believe the government's going to save us. Don't worry, you don't have to act, don't get upset. The government's going to save us. Technology will save us. We're just going to be able to be so smart that we're going to work ourselves out of this ecological crisis by just having better toys, better tools. Or the market will save us, right? We can buy green and we don't actually have to change our consumption patterns drastically. All we have to do is just, buy the more eco-friendly version, and we're gonna be fine, And if everybody just recycles and uses canvas bags and buys eco soap, we're gonna be great. These I would call control mythologies, or deep-seated underlying assumptions that can keep us stuck when what we really need is leadership that innovates and leadership that leads us to a way of resolving the problems that are people-centered. I don't just talk about solar energy. I talk about small-scale, site-appropriate, community-driven, community-led solar. That's the real, alternative. That's the real renewable in my mind. And so that's kind of the piece that we're talking about. And what I would encourage you to do at some point in the future is to spend some time thinking about your own underlying assumptions, the limitations that they have, and the way in which you're limiting your own leadership and your own possibilities because of underlying assumptions. And again, this could be another whole class, but we'll leave it there for now. This awareness, though, I would say, is again probably one of the most important best practices of a leader who wants to lead folks towards social change. And I wanted just to sort of let this sink in, share a quick story about Robert Desnos. Who in the room has ever heard of Robert Desnos? He's a surrealist poet. Anybody ever heard of Robert Desnos? Okay, so this will be fun. This is a real true story, which is kind of exciting. And when I think about underlying assumptions or control mythologies that can be shifted by creativity and by innovation and by hope, and an exploration of deep surrealist potential, leadership qualities, I think about Robert Desnos. So Robert Desnos was a surrealist poet. He is a survivor of the Holocaust, and he was in a concentration camp in World War II. He was loaded up one day with a bunch of other men onto the bed of a large truck and taken away. And leaving the barracks, the mood was obviously very somber. They all knew they were going to the gas chamber. It was over for them. As the truck pulled in, nobody said a word. Nobody was talking at all. Even the guards were not talking to one another. And the silence was broken by Robert Desnos jumping up and grabbing a hand of one of the men on the back of the truck who was bound for the gas chamber and reading his palm, giving him a palm reading that said, "Oh, you're going to have such a long life. How many children do you have? Because this says you're going to have 4 more children. Oh, this is so exciting. You're going to have an amazing life." And so he was excited, and his excitement was contagious, and he was very exuberant. And one man after another thrust their palm in front of him and said, "Read mine, read mine." And the predictions were the same for all of them, right? Longevity, more children, an abundant life full of joy and wonder. And as he read more palms, something shifted, and it wasn't just in the prisoners. It actually happened in the guards. And it was this unexplainable thing where maybe there was a shadow of a doubt suddenly planted in their minds. And when they had thought that this, their path that day to execute these people was inevitable, it just seemed like that's how it was going to go. But suddenly now there's this doubt, and the change of the mood really switched things up for the guards. And all of the men, along with Desnos, got packed back onto the truck and taken back to the barracks. And they did not die that day. Basically, Robert Desnos had saved his own life and the lives of others by using his imagination, leading with creativity, and refusing to fall down in the face of these underlying assumptions. And that's not even a control mythology. It's control reality, even in those moments. And because of that, he did something completely improbable that had never happened before. And he lived out his life in a camp. He actually died just a few days of old age or whatever he died of, but just not quote unquote natural causes, just a few days before the war ended. But many, many people went on to live because of him and told that story. And there's something in that that speaks to what I think I am most excited about trying to cultivate when it comes to leadership. So I wanted to share that story. As a surrealist poet, French poet, if you read French, you might do well. With a good translation, you might be fine. I find most of his poetry really hard to understand, but this story was crystal clear for me about this contribution that he had made in his life. And it's allowed me at times to take solace in what seemed like the absolute impossibility, the absolute predetermined fate of a situation I was in, and take creative, playful, loving action anyway. Because who knows, like look what Robert was able to do. So I wanted to share a little bit about him with you. What I was going to suggest, what I was going to suggest is this. I'd like to offer you a little time to play around with an exercise to think about your own leadership. And the reason I want to do this is because of what this pyramid tells us. Effective communication, but I think also effective leadership, demands this alignment between not just what we say and do, but our beingness, who we're being, our soul, our vision, and our values. And we hear a lot in society about the either discourse or the closeness between what we say and what we do. That conversation happens a lot. But this idea that the underpinning of this is who we are, our core beingness, is something that I hadn't seen before. And so this exercise, which I wanted to offer you, is about uncovering your heart's desire. And I wanted to invite you for a few minutes to just take an inventory and draw these quadrants on your page. What we have is an opportunity to think about how we want to lead and what we want to do. Like literally, this is about skills and how you give of yourself as a leader and in a career path. And just because you can doesn't mean you have to. And so what does it look like to be a leader and to lead in a way that's truly you fostering your heart's desire? And so we've got, the corner, I'm great at this and I love doing it. What are the things that you would put in there, that your strengths and your skills? I'm great at it, but I really don't love it. I'm not so great at it yet, but you know what? I really do love it and I want to get better at it. And then I'm neither great at it nor do I love it. And the columns on the left really represents your heart's desire and the opportunity. And so I want to give you a couple minutes to just spend some time scribbling on this. And so take 5 minutes, do this, and then we'll come back and do some questions. But, for me, this is a key underpinning to being a good leader, whether you're leading for change in social change movements or whether you're leading in any other space. What does it look like to really allow yourself the gift to lead according to what your heart's desire is? So spend a little time on this, and then we'll open it up for some questions. I think let's just come, if people are okay with this, let's come back as a big group and share some reflections on the exercise. I mean, first, on the exercise itself, how does it feel to do this, to make this designation? Is this something you've done before? Is it new to you? Tell me about the process of it. Anyone?
So maybe it would be kind of nuts for me to run around. So if you have thoughts, maybe to say them loudly, and the microphone, I'll try to put it in your general direction.
I got something.
Okay, Sebastian?
Surprisingly. It's difficult to come up with things that you're really great at but don't like doing.
Can you hear that, Celia?
I did, and I would say, well, good for you. I mean, it's great. I can say that I am really good at pitching stories to the mainstream or corporate media, but I don't like it anymore. Media relations used to be relating to media, and I used to think of it as an organizing opportunity. I was organizing reporters, and it's a kind of a strange constituency, but I could get them on board. They have a big amplification, a big reach. And now, because there's no relating left, we talk to them on Facebook and Twitter and shout out on LinkedIn, and that's how the stories get played. I'm not enjoying it anymore. And that was a change in the marketplace and in technology that shifted my interest. And I had to recreate my life when I decided I was not going to be a publicist anymore. But if you're finding that you don't have anything in that quadrant, I would say, well, good for you. you know.
Yes, you're shaking your head there, Sebastian. You don't have words?
I just don't want to monopolize it.
Okay. All right. Radu?
Yeah, I have a question. We had actually a guest speaker this morning from University of Victoria, very excellent scholar in leadership, and her emphasis was to stay away from power, leadership styles, distancing itself from power, and emphasizing on servant leadership. But in your opening actually slide, it seems like you are emphasizing about power. In fact, there is a slide that's about power, power over, power with, power within. Can you elaborate with that in the general leadership, discipline? Which are we trying to ascertain which one is good and which one should work?
It's a really interesting question. I don't see the two as mutually exclusive. When I am doing my heart's desire, what I am called to do, I feel that that is when I'm in the greatest service. That's when I'm doing the work I'm meant to do. And that is, I don't think of it as a servant as much as I think about being a vessel for the divine to work through me. And so it isn't about me. There's a selflessness to it, but it's also something that I truly love. And I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I see that if you're making a Venn diagram, the sweet spot is that overlap where you find both, hence this exercise. But I very much consider the work I do as service. And if you were to look at my, income statement, you would probably agree. I could make a lot more money selling young people jeans and beer and, hard liquor and TV dinners, but I don't, because these stories and these culture shifts are the ones that I want to engage in to make the world a better place. Can you tell me more about where you see the discourse or where you've heard the discourse between her talk and mine?
Sorry, can you repeat that? Where I saw?
Where you saw the disconnect, where you saw them as not related.
Yeah, so actually it's about like how we should define power and leadership in the context of studying leadership. Where is power rests or exists? Is it within?
Well, and again,
is there? Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Yeah, so is it within or without or both?
Well, obviously this is personal. For me, in terms of my theory of change, I believe that we'll be the best people that we can be as individuals, and the best culture that we can be as a collective when we move from a distributed power over dynamic to a people power dynamic. And this means more people having the ability to be self-actualized and have control over their own life, the decisions that they make, what they have access to in terms of food, water, shelter, education, all of these things that allow them to have the best life that they can have. And so for me, my thought is that I want to lead in a way that moves power toward this power with and power within. But that's my opinion, and that's because I'm oriented towards that particular kind of social change.
And I think that if Carolyn was here, she'd say, again, using the example of Martin Luther King, he was, and she promotes him as a servant leader, very aware of power, because that's just part of the strategy of a more effective servant, serving the people. But if you're going to serve the people, you've got to. It's not just being soft, right? As we had the brief comment about Jasper's comment this morning. It's about knowing where power lays, so you can be an effective agent of change. But it's just a different orientation, perhaps, for to how we might think of leadership. So I don't see that. I don't know if you agree, Celia, but I don't see a concern about power precludes and awareness of one's servant leadership.
By the way,
Yeah, no.
We'll go to, 1 second. We'll go to, go ahead.
to clear up, my question doesn't come from doubt, actually. It's more from curiosity. Just,
Okay.
My insight to that particular discussion, Ron, is that coming from the heart doesn't mean only coming from myself. Doing something selfishly is not necessarily the same as doing something out of love, which relates to the different meanings of love, and in particular the Greek concept of agape, which is my love carries to others and to the community and to the wider self. So, yeah, if what drives your heart drives you to do something only for yourself, that's egotism, and that's a trap. If you love doing something for others, then following your heart is a good thing.
Nice point.
Yep.
There was a, sir,
My point was just
just loudly, because I don't think she'll hear you from the back there.
my point was more for Bahani, and that was my perspective on tying the two talks together. And I think her point is about power to the people. It's really where the power is residing. Is about power to the people is like power to the followers. It's essentially what Caroline was saying this morning is that a leader will divest some of his power to the followers and thereby empower them.
Or the other way of looking at it is that when you turn things around, and this book by about community, I can't remember the author, it'll come to me, but he says we have to turn these things around, that followers make leaders, right? So the leader is a leader as long as the followers agree that they're there. What happened when Carolyn this morning brought up, the Arab Spring, what's going on in China right now? It's really the leaders. It's what happened in the American Revolution. It's the followers saying we don't acknowledge the legitimacy of the leaders anymore because they're no longer serving us. Mm-hmm. And I think that's go ahead, Carol, Celia.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why I wanted to bring up underlying assumptions and control mythologies, because literally there is power over, physical slavery, and then there is psychic slavery. And where are you, or is anyone, in a state of psychic slavery? And how do we liberate ourselves? How do we, there's decolonization, and then there's the decolonization of your imagination, of your spirit, of your revolutionary imagination and spirit. And what does it look like to stop and see those places where we've allowed ourselves to become enslaved, and then we limit what we think of as our personal power and our ability to stand as leaders and change what isn't working for us. And whether it's, whether you're talking to someone who really is the boss of you because they're your manager, or you're talking to your sibling and you can say, you're not the boss of me. The reality is there is still a way in which the breaking free of that psychic slavery is this critical piece that we can control. And the willingness to note those things, those perceived power dynamics, and lead in a way that shares power, to me, that's the way forward in the 21st century. It's the way we're actually going to get through what's to come, because it's not necessarily going to be a pleasure cruise for the next 25 years on planet Earth.
But it's interesting because the first step in that process is the awareness that there are other ways of thinking, right? If we have to liberate ourselves from the idea that there's only one correct way. So I think, maybe some of you know of Vandana Shiva, a great Indian scholar, leader, clearly. And one of her early books was called Monocultures of the Mind, right? That's what we're being trained to think, is that there's one way to understand the world. We have mental monocultures. And I think it is part of our tasks to bring a little diversity into that monocultural set. Yes, Linda.
I've just noticed the common theme in a lot of these models saying things like you have to change the leaders and change the management as like a step. To me, that's a pretty big roadblock. Like, do you use any tools for actually changing the people in power? Because, from a low-level employee in a big corporation, it's easy to say just change the management. That's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's a great point that you're limited to the places that you have high touch, so maybe it's about the way you show up among your coworkers. But part of this also starts to come true at a larger level in terms of how we think about solving our problems. Are we resolving the challenges we face in our food system because of climate chaos by trying to change things at a large monocultural global level where our pantry, our global pantry, our global food shed is organic food grown in China? Or are we cultivating small community gardens and thinking about eating locally and eating seasonally and eating regionally so that our food pantry is within a shorter carbon footprint from our home? Those kinds of things are a little easier to see this than in how do we change the leadership. But, I mean, never underestimate the importance of the value of a suggestion box. And if there isn't one in your organization, there should be, and there need to be talkback systems. I mean, things like 360-degree reviews. Fortune 500 companies do them all the time. Nonprofits do them. I'm surprised how many folks don't have them. But to introduce the idea that rather than just a review where you sit with your manager and review yourself and they evaluate you, what would it look like to create a 360 evaluation program so that your management and leadership can be evaluated by everybody you're touching? Those kinds of things are happening more and more.
But in the context, Linda, where you are just a small piece of a big company, no, you can't change leaders. But what you can do is you can do stuff differently. And that's all we have at the least, that's something any of us can do. And we always have the possibility of putting our resignation letter in our pocket. So, I think part of all this is, and the reason I've tried to stress this concept of leadership without authority is that at the least we can act honorably with integrity, and people will see us doing it. And in a lot of places, people will say, oh, Linda's someone I'm going to go to when I have an issue or a problem, or she's someone I can trust. She works with integrity, and the rest of the people here I don't know about, like the lawyer who Leith was talking about. But and this is all we can do, because it's very easy to talk about big change, but we have to go back into our institutions, and we can model alternate ways of being. We can get involved in committees, maybe to investigate something. Put your hand up and say, I'll be on that committee, right? This is all we can do. We can only do what we can where we are with the people that are around us, but we have to be looking all the time, where are we, who is around us, and what can we do? Valentina?
And I would just say,
sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Situation of this thing. For what situations does this apply then? If this is not applicable in the work environment, what are we talking about then? In what situations we can change the management? Are we talking about like political changes?
Well, I think it's not necessary that we're talking about changing management. We're talking about change, right? And sometimes the only change I can make is a change right around me, and if it's worth doing, I'll do it. And if it has other implications and ramifications, I'll do that in a context where I'm part of a big organization. In my neighborhood, what can we do? In our political life, what can we do? In our clubs and organizations, what can we do to move towards more wholeness? The stuff that the servant leadership was pointing out. Can we, Celia, might we just go a few more things here? Jasper, sure. In the back. Okay.
Are you saying anything more than just to lead by example? There are more to it than that?
I think it's also a question of what are we leading, and how are we leading? We can lead by miserable example. We can try it. Yeah. Yeah, our actions are very powerful. They're very influential. We watch. I believe we watch and we are watched all the time.
New norms.
Norms. Yeah. Thank you. Check mark for generality. Good.
The other thing I'll just toss in here is that I'm part of a social entrepreneurs academy called Move the Crowd, and it's focused on supporting people like myself who want to do social good work and consider ourselves social entrepreneurs and are thinking about our business and growing our business. And there are people who are starting hip hop clubs, and there are people who are communications consultants, and there's all sorts of people in this. And when they do a piece on leadership, it's not leadership with a capital L. It's actually an L3. How do you live? How do you love? And how do you lead? with a presupposition that the first two, there's a liberation and a growth in the first two that allows you to really build the third. And so, that's another orientation towards thinking about, what these things have to do with one another and where your own power can come just by how you show up.
I have a fair bit of experience with large organizations, and when you talk about changing the management, what you're talking about is doing the action that you can, and knowing that that action will have ripples. And maybe the first ripple won't get to the top, but you keep doing it, you keep doing it, you keep doing it until the ripples reach and make an effect. Because they will have an effect on the person that's further up the chain, and maybe he'll change his outlook a little tiny bit. And when we're talking about changing, we're talking about just shifting the vision sometimes until they can see something different, and then the big change is going to happen. So yeah, you plug at it. That's really the only thing you can do.
At times it is the only thing you can do, and you may not be successful, right? Success is definitely not guaranteed in any of this stuff.
Well, more to
yeah.
Susan?
more to that point, it's similar to that story where you have that person standing up and dancing, and then the second person is like the leader. So in a large organization, you can have that happen in a small way, and eventually things do change. And if one or two people don't take that opportunity, you then just exist with an organization with a higher top management nobody wants, because nobody's willing to challenge it.
Or you end up in an organization where you try and create change and then get fired. Yeah, from personal experience.
No, but that's true, and it's not a trivial thing to say from personal experience that all of a sudden you're running on the wrong side of history in that organization, and they'd rather see you elsewhere. And that is the risk. I mean, this is not a guarantee that everything will unfold as you would hope it to unfold. So it is there are dangers in doing anything like this. Susan, yes, again. Yeah.
Well, just on that topic, I a couple of years ago challenged the people I work with in the provincial government, and before I did it, I thought I could lose my job. I couldn't afford to lose it, but I felt that this was something I had to bring to their attention. It was scary. And actually, I went into a little mini depression over it, and I knew I had to do something. So I didn't lose my job, and I came here. I was still working at the same place, but there is that point where you decide, well, is it worth it to make a change, or do I stay here, or do I look for another job?
Yeah. I used to feel that every public servant should have at least one letter of reprimand on their file through their life where they haven't done their job properly. Right? Because you have a lot of protection as a public servant, even to speak out against your employer. I did it once very visibly, and it was a great experience. I had a whole number of steps leading me to be fired. They didn't fire me. I left beforehand. But sometimes you just got to push these guys. It's just like your own integrity. I tell you stories about almost being fired from government. I have a bunch of them. Christopher.
Yeah, we're worried about thinking back to Rick's comments about some different types of leadership suited and some very interesting observations. What do you feel is a potential legitimate use of the more top-down approach that you have on premier making a decision for a mayor? What are your thoughts on what's going too far? What are the limits to that top-down use?
Can you repeat the question, Rick?
The question simply was, what's your sense about situations where you might actually need a top-down approach to leadership?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, form needs to follow function, always. I, for example, worked for Greenpeace and for Sea Shepherd, and in both those cases, I was really glad that there was a captain of the ship. I've worked on actions where they were very highly technical, and we were doing, creative action things like banner hangs or other types of civil disobedience, where I was really glad that there was a chain of command, that there was a safety coordinator who was checking out for everyone's safety, that there was a police liaison. I'm not saying that there's any one type of leadership structure that is different than the next, but even in a top-down hierarchy, you can be along that continuum anywhere other than the top, and have an experience of power with and power within. Or your captain can govern in a way where you don't have that experience. And which one is going to draw out the best qualities in you and allow you to be the best you can be, so that then the ship can be as tight as it needs to run, or the company can run at optimum. So this isn't about being in favor of anarchy or, consensus-based decision making over top-down. But it is also about clarity. I don't know if you guys have ever seen Darcy. Do you use Darcy at all? Anybody use Darcy? DARCI? So it's who's the decider, who's accountable, who's responsible, who's consulted, and who's informed. And and it's just a way of creating clarity in leadership. So the key here is an experience of being fully self-expressed, being governed in a way that I'm safe. Sure, but there is a way in which that becomes oppression or limitation, where I have to break out of that psychic slavery so that I can lead. The guy who works in the engine room and the cook and the person who mops the deck can lead. It's not just the captain's deck where the leadership comes from. And if you've ever been in a place like that, it's an incredible feeling to feel everyone in a path of leadership and power, regardless of what it says on their name tag as their title.
Okay, Candace?
Well, I'm sort of curious about what we do next with the exercise.
We did leave the exercise.
Yeah.
Here's what I would recommend. I would recommend that you do it as an inventory for your skills of where you are now. And then, maybe you share it with someone. Maybe you have somebody who knows you really well check it to make sure you're not being too humble about what you're great at. And my feeling is at the bottom right quadrant, you banish. There is absolutely no reason that the universe will be served or the planet will be served by you doing something that you're both not good at and don't love. So forget about it. And then how does everything else move so that you're building that left side of the column, that you're growing the places that you want to stretch yourself and grow your skills, and that you're moving into a place that you not only have proficiency and mastery eventually, but that you also really enjoy. And so, and I've taken the test and then put it aside and pulled it out of my journal 3 years later and looked at it to see if it was still true. I've shared it with potential employers when I was in the interview process. Say, look, this is really where I'm at. This is what I'm about. We switch up the job description and the way the department works a little bit to bring me in and have me at my best for you, because I want to show up for you. So those are just a couple ways you can use it.
Thank you.
Okay, I have about another 5 minutes, Celia. So, will you send me this? Is it okay for me to distribute this to people?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I'll send it out as a PowerPoint, because the portion that I didn't actually go into has some graphics. And I actually, if there isn't another question, I might just close sharing a few more slides. But I'm also happy to.
Oh, we do have a question on this side. Hold on, we're going to rotate around.
Just given your expertise, something that came out of my thesis work for my work, I manage a car share cooperative, and there's some social benefits that are not recognized, like increasing community safety, fostering a culture of sharing, kind of intangible things. What would you recommend for communicating that type of information to people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, there is a communication tool that I like to use a lot that I refer to as making the invisible visible. How do you do that? And I think that finding clever ways through the communication channels and media channels you're using now to talk to your customers or potential customer base, or to other audiences you need to reach to show off about these benefits so that you can get perks. Maybe it's about reaching city officials so that they see that. How do you make the invisible visible? And you can gamify that. There are clever ways that you can show that, invite the people who are using the cars to be demonstrative of those unseen benefits. But shared economy and collaborative economy spaces are some of the most important and sort of growing spaces. A lot of people think it's sort of the big wave, the big cultural wave that's trending, and it's still a tsunami that's forming. You know, the waves have lapped up on the shore, but the real impact and the big business opportunities are to come. And so, what does it look like to look at how others are doing that, whether it's in the food sector or in the lodging sector like Airbnb? Are there other ways that you can notice and borrow from others in collaborative economy who are making the invisible visible? And then are there just clever ways to do that? Because there may be metrics that you can share. There may be testimonials from customers that speak to this. But figuring out how to articulate it is really, really important. It's gonna be something that allows your business model to grow for a lot of different reasons. You know, there's a lot of reasons why people are choosing now for convenience to car share, but people who might choose it for these other benefits, those benefits need to be marketed. So how do you integrate that into your stories?
We'll be talking a bit about some of that stuff. It's interesting because this Blue Boundary project I'm going to present to you tomorrow, in some ways, is all about this project that we want to do on Vancouver Island, which is about making things that are invisible visible. So maybe we'll bring some ideas through that leadership project that we'll be doing. Thanks. Okay, Celia, I guess time to bring it on home.
Well, you know, I'll just say in closing that it's really a treat to have the opportunity to talk with you all and to begin to cultivate in my own mind an answer to this question, you know, about leadership. I don't know that I had necessarily, until I did this presentation, really thought about the answers to these questions, you know, and specifically in the social change space, in the social movement space, highlighting and drawing out these elements of what are the qualities of good leaders. So it's been, you know, I just have a lot of gratitude for being able to spend a little time with y'all. And more than anything, I really want to encourage you all to do whatever exercises you need to do to begin to surface your leadership potential and the unique role that I know each and every one of you has to play in the unfolding of a better world. So thank you for studying and doing what you're doing and for whatever you're going to do next. Thank you.
Celia, thanks for doing this. This took time for you to do, and you're doing other things. Greatly appreciated. We'll keep connected on this stuff, and I hope the rest of your time in San Diego goes really well.
Thanks, and I'll send you the PowerPoint, and you can let me know how to get my hands on the recording if Dave helps you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Good luck, everyone.
Thanks, Dave.